women need to have the same opportunities to shape digital technologies.
I am turning to all women active and interested in digitalization.
And position young women and girls as not only consumers but also producers within the digital sector.
The industry is ready to embrace us all, and when we get into the industry, we will shape our own future.
Hello and welcome to Women Leading Digital, a podcast by GIZ where we discuss digital transformation and technology with leading voices from around the world. I am Pooja Raghavan. In this episode, we will be exploring how the worlds of policy researchers and policy practitioners intersect when it comes to building inclusive DPI and how it is enacted on the ground.
The more you expose yourself to different perspectives and experiences, and the more you will be able to contribute to both policy and tech.
It's endless, right? What technology has opened, endless issues and challenges.
Now I'd like to welcome my guests, Marushka, Chocobar, Reyes and Teki Akutteh. Our first guest, Marushka, joins us from Lima, Peru. She's currently a member of the Council for the Digital Talent Fund at SHOI and a member of the Innovation Committee at the National Confederation of Private Business Institutions. Marushka, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm looking forward to learning more about your impactful work.
Hi, Puja. I'm totally honored to be here today.
We are also so delighted to have Teki join us. She is a lawyer who works at the intersection of research and academia in the digital public infrastructure world. Teki is the founder and director of the Africa Digital Rights Hub, a non-profit think tank that advances and promotes research and advocacy on digital rights across the African continent. Hello, Teki. I'm so excited to have you join us from Accra today.
Hi, Pooja. Thank you for having me.
Teki, I'll start with you. What motivated you to work in the field of research, and also what sparked your interest in digital rights in the DPI ecosystem?
So for me, having worked a lot for the government of Ghana in the process, I also had the opportunity to work across the continent of Africa. There was always one thing that I thought was a bit baffling. I saw the limitations, and so we saw a lot of our governments actually taking on either laws and policies because they were looking at it from the standpoint of how the West was looking at these issues. And we knew very well at the time that the approach of the West is very different. Our ecosystems are very different. The resources that we have available are different. The skill set that is also available to address these issues are different. And so I thought that it was really important, particularly around the technological issues, to start looking at some of these things from the African perspective.
It's so inspiring to hear about your motivation, Teki. And Marushka, what motivated you to work in government? And could you tell us a bit more about what got you interested in the field of digital policy?
I have always been passionate about public services and making a positive impact on society. The main project that I could manage was the design of the National Digital Transformation Policy. We developed this policy during the COVID-19 pandemic.
And did you face any kind of challenges during your work with this project and this sort of policy making?
I think one of the challenges to developing inclusive digital public infrastructure in Peru is the listen to people. Put in this kind of policy their real needs. For example, when we talk about inclusive digital public infrastructure, we need to put our focus in the low penetration of broadband services, for example, especially in rural and remote areas.
And Teki, what challenges have you faced in your work? I know from my own experience that being a woman in law can be quite hard.
So it's always been challenging as a woman and a woman in a leadership position. I'm constantly having to sometimes question my approach So when I'm talking to men, we come to that point where you are able to say anything to any other colleague, but just because you're a woman and the person is a man, it doesn't matter what, you have to find apparently a softer way of saying what you need to say. And I would say that in all of that, it really helped me hone my, I would say, human interaction skills.
Thank you for sharing something so personal, Teki. Since our audience now has a glimpse of the two of you personally, I would like to move towards questions about your work, more specifically in DPI, and how new technologies are affecting this work. Marushka, I'll start with you. As someone who has worked for the government throughout your career, how has inclusion in DPI improved, and where do you still see gaps?
I think another challenge, for example, is the lack of coordination and integration among different public agencies and levels of government in implemented digital public infrastructure. For example, OECD put in the studies about our countries the real needs to ensure a whole of government approach to digital transformation with clear roles and responsibility, common standards and interoperability, and effective monitoring and evaluation. We need to balance the opportunity and risk of digital public infrastructure too, especially in terms of privacy, security, and inclusion.
Thank you so much for your insights, Marushka, and also for telling us about the value of effective monitoring and evaluation. Going back to you now, Teki, I'm curious. When did you initially become interested in DPI, and how did this develop over the years?
About 3-4 years ago, when this whole issue of digital public infrastructure started picking up, I thought, this may be a very interesting approach for the African countries, particularly around issues of ownership, around development, and just to ensure that there's continuous innovation and all of that. So for me, that is really where the interest in DPI came about. And looking at it again from the perspective of how do African countries look at this to explore, and continuing to look and learn around how do we use this to leverage and build capacity and make technology more accessible to everyone.
I think that's so interesting to hear, Teki, especially how your engagement with DPI has increased over the years progressively. And I now wonder, what have been some of the main DPI projects that you have focused on in your work? And what did you learn about the field of DPI through these projects?
An area of DPI that we've done quite a bit of work around has been on national IDs. If you come into a lot of our communities where a lot of people still don't have access to these IDs, and most of them fall below the lower income brackets. If you go further, you would see that majority of these people are women. Then you end up realizing that we're excluding a whole gender, we're excluding a vulnerable group. So we are working around digging the problems out and saying, okay, how do we find a better solution to really making this happen? Because for me, it's extremely important that we make sure that we leave no one behind. So those are some of the things that we do around this area. And we see that DPIs are a core component to actually facilitating this access.
Thank you so much for bringing that up, Teki. Marushka, in your experience of working with the government, what are some of the ways that you think that the Peruvian government and governments in general can foster inclusion in digital spaces? What is the government's role?
I believe that the way that governments can foster inclusion in digital spaces is by including the vulnerable population in the discussion of public policy. This is the only way to understand their real needs. The government in Peru is taking several measures to solve the problem of digital exclusion, such as approving the National Policy of Digital Transformation until 2030. The policy also supports the implementation of digital basic, for example, basic basket program, which will provide the population with access to digital connectivity services, devices, data package, and training. Another example of the services of this policy is to use the digital payment methods in social programs, the creation of a digital identity framework, and the development of digital skills and innovation, and the protection of children in the internet.
It's so interesting to hear these steps that the Peruvian government is undertaking. I'm also curious to ask you about the rise of artificial intelligence or AI in policy making. I was recently reading about the new legislation on AI passed in Peru in July of 23, and we know how AI is taking the entire digital transformation space by storm now. And in that context, what is the potential of AI's role in DPI? And how will this new legislation in Peru affect your own work?
Okay, artificial intelligence, I think, can improve DPI by providing and offering better and more personalized, diverse, and inclusive digital services and resources for the public entities. The artificial intelligence can also help to ensure the quality and security of the digital data and infrastructure, as well as to foster the digital collaboration and cooperation. In Peru, we have artificial intelligence law that promotes the use of this kind of technology in the productivity sectors and the main public services that people need, such as education, health, security, and justice. The new legislation, I think, will affect, for example, my work or the work of government by introducing more challenges and requirements for the design and implementation of AI systems, for example, as well as by ensuring the transparency of AI process.
And could you elaborate a bit more about what you mean by the challenges that AI could bring in just the implementation and design of policy?
Yes. So AI have a lot of opportunities such as technology, emerging technology, but this technology need to put in the agenda with the equity and ethical use aspect. For example, in Peru, the legislation recognized the importance of gender equality and non-discrimination in the sector, but the law did not provide sufficient resources and mechanism to ensure their effective implementation. So we need to put all of efforts in order to implement AI system, but with this ethical and privacy aspect.
Thanks for sharing some of the challenges that policymakers are experiencing in navigating new technologies like AI. I'm wondering, Teki, as someone working at the intersection of research and policy yourself, what are some of the ways academics and researchers are impacting the issues that policymakers focus on?
Well, I wouldn't call myself an academic. I am a lawyer that is pushing. I see academia as a very important part of knowledge building. We thought that it was quite important to have a collaboration with academia, especially when our focus was going to be on research. And the reason why we needed to do that was to have a sustainable approach to these issues. I think that sometimes it's very difficult to put all of this on governments. However, if we have a well-researched paper, if we have a well-researched thought process, it is quite easier for a technocrat to look at it, appreciate the issues, and be able to advocate or take the right decisions for it.
Could you tell us a bit more about the process of collaborating with policymakers as a researcher? What does it actually look like on the ground?
Working with all these people is very different, especially from the civil society perspective. And I think that sometimes what we fail to see is that policy development works within a certain context and framework. And a lot of the time, we don't want to understand. When we're civil societies, like, we need this, we want this change, but we don't really understand what the processes are to actually get that change to happen. Because we all have different languages within which we work. And that is why I think that collaboration is extremely important. If you understand what my challenges are and I understand you, I'm in a better position to maybe make proposals based on what may work for you. And you are also in a better position because you understand your situation to come up with a solution that is beneficial within the context of what you're doing.
Thanks for walking us through that. Now, Marushka, you've been a practitioner for a very long time now. And it's always interesting to hear about how the worlds of academia, research, and policy making go together. How do you factor in academic research when designing gender inclusive policy?
Academic research is an essential factor for designing gender inclusive policy, I think. I use, for example, academic research to identify the gaps and barriers that different groups of people facing in accessing opportunities and resources. I also use academic research to inform the best practices and strategies to address these issues and promote gender equality and inclusion in various sectors and contexts. For example, we developed in Peru a letter of digital rights to learn and to put in the agenda the challenges and solutions for enhancing gender equality.
Thank you both for your insights. Looking to the future, how do you think academics can provide better policy recommendations? And how can practitioners enact policies that best utilize the current research on inclusive digital policy?
I think that academic can provide better policy recommendations by making their research more accessible. This means, for example, publishing their findings in outlets that practitioners can easily find and understand, such as podcasts like this, for example, newsletter or magazine. It also means highlighting the practical implication and recommendation of their research and providing evidence-based solutions and innovations for the problems that practitioners face.
And Teki, what do you wish to see more from policymakers in the future, and how can they better utilize the findings from researchers?
A lot of the things that happen in the digital ecosystem, whether government, whether private sector, whether academia, it all starts around the table of conversation. What we really need to do is create that conversation. Of course, today we'll call it multilateral conversations across different stakeholders. And I think that should happen a lot more. I think that governments have to be more deliberate about these issues and realize that, particularly when it comes to digital rights, DPIs, and the like, it's not a decision that you make on the spur of the moment.
Thank you both for sharing your wisdom and experience with us. I would like to now move to our final topic of discussion. Many of our listeners are young women who work in public policy or who work in tech and are looking to combine the two of them in their own careers. Do you have any advice for them?
I'm very happy to this question because I would like to say that you have chosen a very exciting and challenging career path, and I applaud you for that. My advice for you is to be proactive and seek out mentors, role models, and peers who can support you and inspire you.
Thank you so much for your words, Marushka. That's really good advice. Teki, what about you? I'm also a lawyer by training and I'm very interested in the digital policy space, which is why I work with GovStack. But I often ask myself if my legal training is holding me back because I don't understand the technical aspects so well. What is your advice for people like this who come from very different backgrounds but want to work in the field?
I think what we need to do is to really start to appreciate and understand these technologies. And thankfully, today there are a lot of resources, thanks to the internet, available that can help you understand what these technologies are. I mean, I started my career because I was very inquisitive. And so I think from whatever field you are in, you're an educationist, you can explore. You're a purely policy development person, you can explore. It's pretty much about understand the context within which you engage in, and then you engage from that point.
Thank you so much for your time, Teki and Marushka. It was so wonderful to have you join us from two different parts of the world today.
I am very happy to do this today. Thanks.
Thank you.
Women Leading Digital is brought to you by GIZ, the Deutsche Gesellschaft für internationale Zusammenarbeit, and is produced by Bear Radio. I'm Pooja Raghavan, and I'm so happy to have been your host for this episode. Follow GIZ for more information, news, and stories on digital transformation and gender at www.bmz-digital.global.